All right. So you really threw us a curveball with this one.
Yeah.
Defunding the police. This is a big one.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And we've got, all sorts of different sources, academic articles,
Yeah.
opinion pieces, even a Joe Rogan podcast clip in here. So
Yeah, the whole spectrum. It's
yeah.
going to be interesting to see what we find.
Yeah. So is this the answer, right? Is this like the radical solution to policing in America, or is this
Right.
something that could make things worse?
Right.
Let's find out.
Well, I think, one thing that struck me as I was looking at all this material is just how deeply intertwined this issue is with the human story. Like, before we get to, the arguments and all the data we have to start with George Floyd,
Yeah.
that video, I mean, it wasn't just an incident, it was a tipping point.
Right. And I remember, when that happened, it felt like the world just stopped.
Yeah.
And suddenly this debate,
Mm-hmm.
that had been, theoretical, kind of in the background for a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
it was visceral. It was like right in your face.
Right. And it was unavoidable.
Yeah.
Like, everyone had to confront it.
Yeah. And that's when this whole defund the police thing,
Exactly.
it went from, a fringe idea
Right.
to like front page news.
Yeah, it forced everyone to kind of deal with some uncomfortable truths
Yep.
about policing in America.
Okay. So let's unpack this a little bit.
Mhm.
What are the arguments for defunding? Because it's, it goes way beyond just, slashing budgets.
Right.
One of our sources, Fernandez, points out that like the first U.S. police departments were essentially slave patrols.
Yeah.
Like that's,
It's a lot to process.
yeah, it really reframes the whole conversation.
It does. It suddenly, we're not just talking about, modern day reforms.
Yeah.
We're talking about a system that was built on a foundation of
Yeah.
control and oppression, and those echoes are still felt today.
And it's not just historical, right? Fernandez also drops this bombshell, like we spend $100 billion annually on law enforcement.
It's a staggering number.
That's more than the GDP of some countries.
It is.
Where else could that money go?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And proponents of defunding argue that by shifting even a fraction of that money to community-based programs, mental health services, affordable housing, youth outreach,
Right.
we could address the root causes of crime, not just the symptoms.
Yeah, it's like instead of calling the police after something bad happens,
Right.
we're investing in preventing it from happening in the first place.
Exactly.
But then, there's the other side of the coin, right?
Of course.
The folks who are adamantly against defunding.
Right. And their concerns are valid, too.
Yeah.
One of the sources, an article by Heather McDonald in City Journal, brought up this point that really stuck with me. There was this neighborhood in Minneapolis that experimented with removing police.
Okay.
And, they were trying to be progressive, but the experiment kind of backfired. And the area ended up with, this massive homeless encampment, crime increased, and residents, especially women, just felt incredibly unsafe.
Yeah.
So, it's a stark example of what can happen when well-intentioned policies
Right.
collide with reality.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Exactly.
It really highlights the human cost of these decisions. Like, this woman's story, she
Right.
had her car checked.
Right.
And she felt completely abandoned.
It brings up that primal need for security, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of your stance on policing, everyone deserves to feel safe in their community.
Right.
And for a lot of people, that sense of safety is inextricably linked to a visible police presence.
So it's not just about statistics and budgets.
Right.
It's about human emotions.
Absolutely.
It's about, fear and security, and that just makes this whole debate so much more.
It does.
But let's be honest,
Yeah.
Even the folks against defunding acknowledge that policing in America needs some serious work.
Absolutely. Reform is a huge part of this conversation. Think of better training, stricter accountability,
Yeah.
addressing those implicit biases that can lead to, racial profiling. But
Right.
is that enough to fix a system that many argue is broken at its core?
Well, you bring up an interesting point there. One of our sources, this academic paper by Schmidt and some colleagues,
Yeah.
it dives into this concept of suspect classification.
Right.
Basically, the idea that the justice system might be treating people differently based on race.
Right.
And this source really breaks it down. For example, it points out that black men are disproportionately arrested and incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
compared to white men, especially for drug offenses.
Yeah.
It's like there's this underlying assumption that certain people are just more likely to be criminals.
Right. And that's what makes suspect classification so insidious. It operates on the subconscious level, influencing everything from, who gets stopped for a broken taillight to who gets a harsher sentence for the same crime. And it all ties back to this question of authority and legitimacy, which the paper also explores.
Okay, now that's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Do people generally accept the authority of the police as legitimate?
Yeah.
And if not, what does that mean for law enforcement in a democracy? I mean, can you really have effective policing if a large chunk of the population doesn't trust the system?
That's the core dilemma, right? You can't just impose order. You have to earn buy-in from the community.
Yeah.
And that's especially crucial in a country as diverse as the U.S.
And that's where this whole conversation about interest groups comes in, right?
Yeah.
Those groups that advocate for specific communities or causes.
Right.
This paper by Schmidt and his colleagues, it really dives into how these groups, especially those representing African Americans, historically have used these indirect techniques, like public pressure, to try to, affect change.
Absolutely. And you can see that dynamic play out so clearly in the aftermath of George Floyd's death.
Right.
The protests, the calls for justice, they weren't just about holding those officers accountable.
Yeah.
They were about demanding a fundamental shift in how we think about policing in America.
It was like a collective realization that this wasn't just a few bad apples situation.
Right.
The system itself was on trial.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful thing.
It is.
But, okay, we've been talking a lot about, the academic side of this debate.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears for a second.
Sure.
You threw in this clip from a Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
Let me just say, I was not expecting that.
I thought it would be interesting to hear kind of a less formal, more conversational take on the issue. Joe Rogan and his guest Duncan Trussell, they're both pretty outspoken.
Yeah.
And they bring up some points that you hear a lot, especially from folks who are, skeptical of the whole defunding movement.
Okay, so set the scene for us. Like, what's the vibe of this podcast clip?
Well, they're talking about this idea that there are good cops and bad cops, right? And maybe the media tends to focus too much on the bad ones.
Right.
And that gives people this skewed perception of law enforcement as a whole.
It's kind of like that saying, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch.
Right.
But in this case, the bunch is like, an entire profession
Exactly.
tasked with upholding the law and protecting citizens.
Right. It's a lot of weight to carry.
That's a lot of weight to carry.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you see so much pushback against the defunding movement, from those who support law enforcement.
Right.
They feel like the actions of a few are being unfairly attributed to the many.
Of course nobody wants to be painted with a broad brush.
Right.
Especially when the stakes are so high.
Yeah, but then again, how do you address this issue of systemic racism
Right.
without acknowledging that the system itself is part of the problem?
That's the tightrope walk, isn't it?
Yeah.
Balancing individual accountability with the need to address these larger systemic issues. It's not an easy solution, and it's one that, policymakers and communities are grappling with right now.
I guess that's why we're having this deep dive in the first place.
Yeah.
Such a layered issue.
It is.
But let's zoom out for a second.
Okay.
And go back to, the core arguments here. We talked about, the historical context, the emotional impact.
Right.
But let's recap the main reasons people are F4R defunding, just so we're all on the same page.
Okay, so in a nutshell, proponents of defunding argue that by redirecting funds away from traditional law enforcement and into community-based programs,
Yeah, okay.
we can address the root causes of crime and violence.
Right.
Things like poverty, lack of opportunity, and mental health issues.
Yeah.
These are the breeding grounds for crime.
Instead of trying to put out fires,
Right.
we're investing in fire prevention.
Exactly.
I get it.
Yeah.
But of course, there's the flip side, those who are against defunding, and they've got some pretty strong arguments too, right?
They do, and a lot of their concerns boil down to safety and security. Remember that anecdote from the Minnesota neighborhood?
Yeah.
The unintended consequences of removing police presence, even with good intentions,
Right.
can be really serious.
And it's not just about crime statistics. It's about that gut feeling,
Right.
that sense of unease when you don't feel protected.
Yeah.
Like logic might tell you that crime rates haven't actually increased.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't always matter when you're walking home alone at night. That feeling of vulnerability is real.
Absolutely. It's a primal instinct.
Yeah.
And it's something that lawmakers and policymakers have to consider when they're talking about these massive shifts in how we approach public safety.
So we've got this tension, right?
Hmm.
On the one hand, this systemic injustice that needs to be addressed.
Hmm.
And on the other, this fundamental need for security that many people associate with law enforcement.
Absolutely.
It feels like a rock and a hard place.
It is, and it's a question that has no easy answers. It requires us to really think critically about what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice, and what kind of future we want to build.
Okay, so if defunding is off the table for some,
Right.
what about this idea of police reform?
Yeah.
Our sources seem to suggest that it's a viable alternative.
Hmm.
But is it enough to address these deeply rooted problems?
Well, reform is a broad term,
Right.
and it can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Yeah.
Are we talking about tweaking existing policies, or are we talking about a complete overhaul of the system?
Right.
And even if we agree on the scope, how do we ensure that these reforms actually translate into meaningful change on the ground?
It can feel overwhelming to think about,
It can.
especially when you consider the sheer scale of the system we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about a few rogue cops.
Right.
We're talking about institutions, policies, deeply ingrained biases. It's a lot.
It is, but it's important to remember that even small changes can have a ripple effect.
That's a good point. It reminds me of something Martin Luther King Jr. said.
Oh, yeah.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
And that bending toward justice doesn't happen on its own.
Right.
It takes individuals, communities, and institutions working together to push for change.
As we're talking, I keep circling back to this idea of suspect classification that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful concept.
It is.
And it really gets to the heart of the racial disparities we see in the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm.
Can we unpack that a bit more? I think it's something our listener really needs to understand.
Absolutely. So suspect classification is basically the idea that law enforcement might be treating people differently
Okay.
based on their race or ethnicity
Okay.
rather than on any specific actions they've taken.
Right.
It's like this invisible filter that skews perceptions and can lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah, like that classic example of driving while black.
Yeah.
Where black drivers are more likely to be stopped and searched by police, even if they haven't done anything wrong.
Exactly. And it's not just about traffic stops.
Yeah.
It can play out in all sorts of ways, from who gets questioned in a stop and frisk to who gets a harsher sentence for the same crime.
And it all feeds into this larger narrative that certain groups are inherently suspicious
Right.
or criminals simply because of their race or ethnicity.
Which, of course, is incredibly problematic, both morally and from a policy standpoint, because when you start treating entire groups of people as potential criminals,
Yeah.
you undermine trust, you erode community relationships, and you create a system that is inherently unfair.
Yeah. It's like we're caught in this vicious cycle,
Mhm.
Suspicion breeds mistrust.
Right.
Mistrust breeds conflict.
Yeah.
And conflict just reinforces those pre-existing biases.
Absolutely.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is, and it all ties back to this question of authority and legitimacy,
Right.
which we touched on earlier, because when a system is perceived as fundamentally unfair,
Yeah.
it loses its moral authority, and that makes it so much harder to enforce the law,
Right.
to maintain order, to build a society where everyone feels safe and respected.
So where do we even go from here?
Right.
It feels like we've uncovered this massive tangled mess,
Yeah.
and there's no easy way to untangle it.
You're right, there are no simple solutions, but I think the first step is recognizing the complexity of the problem. We can't just slap a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
So it's not about finding the right answer.
Yep.
It's about asking the right questions.
Exactly, and those questions should be driving the conversation at every level.
Yeah.
From community meetings to policy debates to, those late night conversations we have with our, friends and family.
Right.
What does public safety truly mean?
Yeah.
Who is the system serving and who is it failing?
Right.
How do we create a system that is both just and effective?
It sounds like we need a complete paradigm shift, not just a few tweaks around the edges.
I think you're right. We need to reimagine what public safety looks like, and that might mean moving away from this traditional model of policing that, many argue is inherently flawed.
Okay, so let's talk solutions.
Okay.
What are some alternative models that might actually address the root causes of crime
Right.
and create a more equitable system?
Well, a lot of folks are talking about community-based initiatives,
Okay.
things like investing in mental health services,
Yeah.
affordable housing,
Yeah.
youth programs, conflict resolution training.
Okay.
The idea is to address those underlying social and economic factors that often lead to crime in the first place.
So instead of just reacting to crime after it happens,
Right.
we're trying to create an environment where crime is less likely to occur in the first place.
Exactly.
I like it's a much more proactive approach.
It is, and it empowers communities to take ownership of their own safety rather than relying solely on law enforcement.
It's like we're shifting from a punitive model to a more restorative one. It's about healing those societal wounds, not just punishing the symptoms.
And that shift requires a fundamental change in mindset,
Yeah,
both on the part of individuals and institutions.
right.
We have to be willing to invest in long-term solutions, even if they don't produce immediate results.
Mhm.
We have to be willing to challenge our own biases and assumptions about crime and justice.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to work together to build a more equitable and compassionate society.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
where does that leave us? What are the key takeaways for our listener, who's been on this roller coaster ride with us?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that this issue is far more complex than it might appear on the surface.
Right.
There are no easy answers, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
It's not about choosing sides.
Right.
It's about understanding the nuances, grappling with the complexities,
Yeah.
and having those tough conversations.
Absolutely.
It's about listening to different perspectives, even those that challenge our own beliefs.
And it's about taking action, however small it may seem. Because every voice matters in this conversation. Every act of engagement, every attempt to understand, every effort to make a difference, it all contributes to that long arc bending towards justice.
So to our listener, we leave you with this.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on this issue? Have your views evolved over the course of this deep dive?
Good question.
What questions are you still grappling with?
And most importantly, what steps can you take to be a part of the solution? Because ultimately, the future of public safety is in our hands. We have the power to create a system that reflects our values, a system that protects and serves all members of our community.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, folks. It's been a real journey, and we hope you've learned as much as we have. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.